Well, a very warm welcome to this session of today's broadcast for the 11/11 Global Shopping Festival in collaboration with Alibaba. My name is David Roth from WPP. Well, pretty much in every single session that we've held right the way through yesterday and in every session today, somebody has mentioned the words AI. Now, either AI is going to be something that is going to be the savior of everything that we're going to do, or it's some sort of buzzword that will appear and then disappear. In order to help us out on all of this, I can't think of a better person to be speaking to us now than Daniel Hulme. I've been very, very fortunate to know Daniel for some time. We spent a couple of days in Silicon Valley a few years ago when it was possible to actually travel and meet in person. I'm very, very delighted that Daniel has now joined the WPP group, not just in terms of Satalia, which was the company that he founded and is the CEO of, but probably more strategically important for WPP, at least from my perspective. Dan might have a different perspective, is that he's also the Chief AI Officer for WPP. Daniel, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks so much, David.
Daniel, I'm going to let you, first of all, talk a little bit about, I suppose, those questions that probably every single person has in the back of his mind or her mind, but probably won't admit it, which is, what on earth is AI? Is it a fad? If it's not a fad, how is it going to help us? Is it our enabler, something that can help us drive our brands and our businesses, or is it something that we need to be very, very wary of? As I said, I can't think of a better person to be able to demystify all of that for us. So Dan, over to you, and we'll come back and discuss some of the themes, the analysis and the observations that you make a little bit later on. But for the moment, over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, David. Yes, so in today's session, what I want to do is I want to cover three things. We're going to talk about AI. We're going to get everybody on the same page in terms of what AI is and isn't. And the second thing we're going to do is talk about innovation, how we can bring people and technology together to do amazing things. And we'll get a bit crazy. We'll also talk about how AI is going to affect humanity in the longer term. So a little bit about me. I wear two hats. For the past 20 years, I've been researching applied AI. I ran a master's program in UCL, which is one of the world's leading universities in AI, where I had about 100 students every year go out there and apply these emerging technologies to solving problems across a whole range of different industries. And I'm currently entrepreneur in residence for UCL, so I help them take deep technology and figure out how to have an impact on the world. I wear a corporate hat, so yes, I'm the CEO of Satalia, which was recently acquired by WPP. Satalia is about 100 people, and we build AI solutions for some of the biggest companies in the world. And I'm very honored to also be the Chief AI Officer for the WPP group, where I'm helping them amplify and accelerate all of the amazing things they're actually doing AI across the globe. So before we get into definitions of AI, what I want to do is I want to take you through this technology stack. This is how I think about data-driven decision making. And usually I make these presentations quite interactive. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer these questions in your mind. And the first question I want to ask you all is at the bottom of that pyramid is, what is data? What is data? I wonder if anybody knows the definition of data. Well, data comes from the Latin word datum, which means given things. It's stuff. It's the fabric of our universe. It's ones and zeros. It's bits and bytes. If I say to you 210280, this is data. If I say that it's the date of birth or how much money I have in my account, then it becomes information. Information is data in context. And there's a big difference between those two things. So let me ask you, what does this say? I'm sure we can all do this one. It says ABC. And if I asked you, what does this say? 12, 13, 14, you can see that the data that's entering your eyes, the stuff in the middle, is the same data, but you're giving it a different meaning based on its context. And if I asked you to read this sentence here, this text, and to picture in your mind what you think that this text depicts, I want you to just take a moment and just think about what that picture, that image is. Maybe many of you are picturing a guy reading a letter out loud to a lady called Mary. And this data can be interpreted in many ways. John could be reading a letter that was sent to Mary, addressed to Mary. John could be reading the letter of the law to Mary. John could be reading a book called The Letter to Mary. John could be reading a book called the letter to a lady called Mary. John could be reading several words on a piece of paper, the letter to Mary. This can actually be interpreted in many, many different ways, and we will all go away with a picture in our mind of what we think is correct, and we're probably wrong. And the goal today is actually to convince you all that humans are rubbish. So one of the things that we've managed to do in computer science over the past decade is take this stuff, this text, this sound, this light, and to actually interpret it in ways that traditionally only human beings can. So if I give you a spreadsheet, and in that spreadsheet it has 3 columns. It has a column which is the date, a column which is the temperature on that date, and a column which is the number of ice creams that I sold on that date. What would we do with this information? Maybe we would kind of organize it to try to identify some patterns. Maybe we would draw a graph. So if I plotted increase in temperature along the x-axis and increase in ice cream sales along the y-axis, what I would see is some sort of trend going upwards. The hotter it gets, the more ice creams we sell. This is called descriptive analytics. What we're doing is we're organizing information to try to find patterns, to try to know things about the world. And we can do something really cool now, which is what everybody's excited about. We can do a thing called predictive analytics, and we can all do this in Excel. We can put a line through it. And now what we have is predictive power. So if tomorrow is 22 degrees outside, I can look at my graph and I can see how many ice creams I need to manufacture. And I would argue that all machine learning, all that data science is trying to do is try to fit some sort of line or plane or hyperplane to some sort of data to give us the best predictive power. And we can get more and more complex. We can use more and more complex mathematical techniques to get a better fit. But this is all we're trying to do with machine learning and data science. Actually, Plato had a really great definition for knowledge. He said knowledge is justified true belief, justified based on our statistical experience. And what we're trying to do is know things or believe things about the world that based on our past experience. But it's very different knowing something to understanding it. So if I asked you, why do we sell ice creams when it's hot outside? Maybe some of you are thinking, well, we're inside, it's hot outside. And what happens in the UK is we go outside because the sun is a scarce resource. And then what happens is if we get too hot and we can take our clothes off, we can cool ourselves down in different ways. We can buy an ice cream, and because of thermodynamics, that cools us down. Now, to expect a computer to understand that narrative from this line is impossible. It's impossible to understand human behavior from these types of lines. There are some lines that you can interpret human behavior, but for the most part, what you want to do is you want to bring people have domain expertise with the people that are really good at finding patterns in data to try to understand the world. Because actually, your domain expert's going to say, Daniel, your model of the world here is wrong. Because if tomorrow is the hottest day ever, what's going to happen is that your factory is going to manufacture lots and lots and lots of ice creams. But the reality is, if it's the hottest day ever, you're not going to sell any because it's too hot for people to go outside. So the model of the world looks more like this, which is why it's really important that we need to bring the people that are very good at finding patterns with the people that are good at interpreting those patterns so that we can ultimately make good decisions. Now, decision making is a completely different field in computer science, and it turns out that humans are actually quite bad at making decisions. I'm going to try and argue this with you now. So I don't know if you've read the book Thinking Fast and Slow, but Daniel Kahneman, a world-leading economist, wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and he argues that we have a fast brain and a slow brain. And I'm going to try to illustrate some of these brains with you now. I'm going to ask you some maths questions, and your job is to answer these maths questions as fast as possible, because if you don't answer them faster than your competitors, they're going to take your markets. So we're going to start out nice and easy, and then we're going to get more and more complicated. Okay, so the first question is, what is 2 times 2? I'm sure we can all do this. It's 4. What is 14 times 768? So this is where you need to use your slow brain. You need to use an algorithm to come up with the answer. This one, you didn't even need to think about it. You just knew what the answer was. Let me ask you a few more maths questions. And again, I want you to answer these maths questions as fast as possible. So the combined price of a bat and a ball is $1.10. The bat is $1 more than the ball. How much is the ball? Combined price is $1.10. The bat is $1 more than the ball. How much is the ball? Maybe many of you are thinking 10 cents. It's not 10 cents. You're not broken. Don't worry. The bat is $1.05. The ball is 5 cents. The combined price is $1.10. The bat is $1 more than the ball. Even those of you that got the answer right, and give you lots and lots and lots of these examples, and you will get them wrong because you're using your fast brain when actually you need to think about it. You need to use your slow brain. Let me ask you another maths question. So imagine these are 5 staff members, and we want to allocate these 5 staff members. Let's say there are 5 salespeople, and we want to allocate these 5 salespeople to the best sales opportunities. We've got 5 sales opportunities, and we need to allocate these 5 people to those 5 opportunities. I wonder if anybody knows how many ways can I allocate these 5 salespeople to 5 opportunities? Do you remember that exclamation mark that we learned in school, factorial, 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1? There are 120 possible ways I can allocate these 5 salespeople to 5 jobs. Let's make the problem a bit more complicated. I've now got 15 salespeople I need to allocate to jobs. Can you tell me how many ways can I allocate these 15 people? Use your fast brain. I wonder what number you're thinking about. It's actually over 1 trillion. So it's 15 times 14 times 13 times 12. You get this number. To expect a human to solve these problems, we're wasting our time. One rule to take away with you today: anything more than 7, don't use a human for. Humans are pretty good at solving problems up to 7. Beyond that, we're pretty useless. And actually, industry have thousands of these types of problems where you have to allocate some sort of resource to some sort of opportunity to maximize some sort of goal. And they don't have problems of this size, they have problems of this size. So here are 500 staff members. Can you tell me how many ways I can allocate them? No, you can't. It's a big number. It's a number that's got over 1,000 digits. And just to put this number into context, this is how many atoms there are in the universe. Once you reach about 60 things that you need to consider, you have more possible considerations than there are atoms in the universe. Again, humans can solve problems up to about 7. You can hire a good computer scientist that can solve problems up to about 40. Beyond that, you need to have deep special expertise in algorithm development. We're going to talk more about this later on. Just to put this into context, one of our clients is a big retailer here in the UK. What we do is we use machine learning to predict footfall, how many people are going to be going into their store, using lots and lots of different data sources, which is one thing that AI is good at. And then what we need to do is make sure that we've got the right salespeople in those stores to maximize that opportunity. And that's, again, a decision-making problem. Let me just drum this concept home. Imagine I've got my ice cream van, and my ice cream van has to deliver ice creams to these 24 points around London. Humans are actually quite good at solving these spatial problems. So after a few minutes, we can draw a nice route around those different points, and we'd be quite happy with that. How long will it take a computer to get the shortest one, the one that's going to save the most amount of petrol, the most amount of time? Maybe seconds or milliseconds. Remember, we've played this game already. It's actually 24 factorial. And if you had a computer that could check 1 million routes a second, it would take 20 billion years to go through every single possible one and say, this one that I looked at 10 billion years ago, this one's the shortest one. And if you had another point in the map, I now have 25 times 20 billion years, 5,000 billion years. If I had another point on the map, I now have 26 times 5,000 billion years. These are exponential problems. They get ugly really, really quickly. And as I said, industry is solving these problems, usually using human beings or old algorithms that were developed 20 years ago. But actually, if you apply modern algorithms, modern approaches to AI, you can really make a dent in these types of problems. And again, just to put this into context, one of our clients is Tesco. It's one of the biggest retailers here in the UK. Historically, they've relied on antiquated algorithms, third-party vendors to solve this problem. We built for Tesco, using the latest and greatest technologies in AI, what they claim to be the best last-mile delivery solution in the world. And they are delivering to 200,000 points on a map, 200,000 factorial. And we don't have millions of years between each customer coming in to optimize those routes. We have seconds or milliseconds between each customer coming in, and we want to show them as many slots back to those customers as possible. So by using these types of technologies, we can really make a dent in these types of traditional supply chain type problems. So when I build systems for organizations, these systems usually have 3 components. They have a data component. We're all going through our digital transformation at the moment. We're bringing all of our data together because we believe that inside that data are lots of insights that can add value into our organization. And there probably are. I have a concern that organizations are architecting their data lakes in the wrong way, but that's a whole different talk. Anyway, everybody's now excited about this middle layer, the insight layer. They're hiring machine learning experts, they're hiring data scientists, they're hiring my students to solve problems in their business. Now, I would controversially argue companies don't have insight problems. They don't have machine learning problems. They have decision decision problems. Decision making, as I said, is a completely different field in computer science. It matured in academia about 2 decades ago. But my concern is that these companies have been hiring the wrong type of people to solve problems that they don't understand. There are actually less than 3,000 really strong optimization experts around the globe. They're often found in Brazil, in the Germanic countries, in Australia. But I would always start out with what decision needs to be made, and then work backwards and say what insights are going to help me make the decision and what data will help me make the insights. Now, if I build a system that I give data to and it makes a decision, and tomorrow I give it the same data, it will make the same decision, what I have is automation. And automation is amazing because we can get computers to find patterns in data better than human beings, and we can get computers to make decisions better than human beings. But the definition of stupidity is doing the same thing over again and expecting a different answer. By definition, automation is stupid. By definition, it is not AI. Now, everybody that currently touches this technology stack is calling themselves an AI company. That's fine because you get more clients and more VC funding. But there are actually 2 definitions of AI. One is more popular, unfortunately, than the other. I think it's weaker, which is getting computers to do things that humans can do. Getting computers to do things that humans can do. Over the past decade, we've managed to get machines to do things that are traditionally in the domain of human beings. We've got machines to recognize objects and images, to correspond in natural language. And because humans are the most intelligent thing we know in the universe, when we get machines to mimic humans, we then assume that that's intelligence. Now, actually, there's a much better definition of AI that comes from the definition of intelligence, which is this. It's a beautiful definition. It's goal-directed adaptive behavior. Goal-directed in the sense we're trying to achieve an objective. We're trying to maximize the number of ice creams we sell. We're trying to maximize the yield using our sales team. We're trying to maximize the reach of our marketing campaigns. You have to have a goal or even a set of goals. Behavior is how quickly I can make decisions to achieve that goal. Now, we've already seen these problems are exponentially in size. They are infinite. And be able to answer these questions quickly and well, it requires a very different set of skills that people are currently hiring for. But the key word for me in this definition is the word adaptive. Ultimately, what we want to do is build systems that make decisions, learn about whether those decisions are good or bad, adapt their own understanding of the world so that next time they can make better decisions. And if I was being brutally honest, I haven't seen a single successful, complex adaptive system in production yet in my life. So actually, I would argue that nobody's really doing the true definition of AI. That's not to say that organizations are not starting to go on this journey. We help companies architect themselves for adaptivity. We help companies build systems that will adapt themselves in production. But building adaptive systems is 10 times more complicated than just building automation. But this is the aspiration. Now, if you go to a CTO and say, I'm going to put a system in production that's going to behave differently today than it will tomorrow, they say, no way is that going into production. I need to make sure my systems behave themselves one day to the next. And if you say to a CTO, I need to put a system in production that needs to make mistakes for it to learn and get better, they say, no way I'm going to put systems in production that are going to make mistakes. Even if automation is making mistakes all of the time, it's just not learning from it. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, Microsoft building a Twitter bot. Lots of teenagers decided to then tease that Twitter bot, and it became a racist, sexist bot very quickly. This is what happens when you put systems in production that can adapt themselves. They can adapt in ways you can't predict. So a little bit of a history lesson. This is Socrates before he drinks hemlock and kills himself. This was AI in the 60s and 70s. What we would do is write down lots of rules and try and infer new knowledge from those rules. So if I say to you, Socrates is a man and all men are mortal, we can infer that Socrates is mortal. And it didn't really scale, it didn't really work. And in the 80s and 90s, a new type of AI that came along that's modeled on how biological systems learn. This is the brain of a bumblebee. 18 years ago, my PhD was trying to model the brain of a bumblebee. Bumblebees have 1 million neurons. Their brains can fit on the end of a needle, tiny, tiny brains. But bumblebees can do amazing things. They navigate 3D worlds, they talk to each other, they solve problems. They don't handle windows very well, but ultimately, they are very smart creatures. And 18 years ago, it was impossible to model 1 million neurons in a machine. But about 12 years ago, there was a new paradigm in this technology, often referred to as deep learning or neural networks, that allows us to model brains that have hundreds of millions of neurons, and we can teach these brains to do things that traditionally only human beings can do. But I would argue these brains are really good at finding patterns in data. They're really good at knowing Socrates is immortal and Socrates is men and all men are mortal. But then what we want to use is these types of technologies to reason, make decisions, to achieve a goal. And then what we need to do is build systems that adapt themselves in production. This is the true paradigm of AI, and we're a long, long way from seeing organizations do this really well. I think there are less than a handful of companies in the world that really know how to do this. This is where it might get a bit weird, but if this semicircle here is the bounds of human ability, I would argue we could probably take any specific thing that a human does, and we can build a solution that outperforms that human at almost any specific task. Now, it's very inefficient and costly to build individual systems that solve individual problems. So there's lots of interesting research going into what is called artificial general intelligence. And actually, this is why humans are very, very special. We are one system that can do many things, and we are incredibly adaptive. So I don't think humans are stupid at all. We're incredibly, incredibly special. But the question is, if we take this idea to its extreme, to its paradigm, we are going to build a brain predicted within our lifetime that is smarter than us in every single possible way. This could be the last invention that humanity creates. It could be the most glorious thing that happens to us. As David said, it could solve all of our problems, or it could be our biggest existential threat. I actually think it's our biggest existential threat, trying to figure out how to solve this problem. But there's lots of interest in this subject, and it is likely to happen in our lifetime. Before we build intelligent systems, we're having to build systems that are making decisions in our everyday lives. I'm sure you've all seen this problem. It's called the trolley problem. I'm in my driverless car. In front of me is a kid. To the left are two adults, and to the right is the cliff. And the car can't stop. Who does the car kill? And if you ask audiences what would they do in this situation, you get very different answers. And we're having to now build systems, whether it's about pricing products or whatever, that are making decisions about people's everyday lives. And these systems we're having to embed and agree as a species what the right thing to do is in these situations. So philosophers for the past 2,000 years have been arguing about what the right thing is to do in these situations, but it's now in human history are we actually having to agree to it. And actually I heard that maybe one day we'll have an ethical setting in our car where we want to kill grandmas over dogs. So actually the decision will be ultimately ours. And this is a whole world of AI safety, AI ethics. There's lots and lots of scaremongery around these types of terms. I would actually argue there's no such thing as AI ethics, that all of these types of questions are really ethical questions. And any consultants that are coming to you trying to sell you AI ethics, I would ask them, how do you feel if you call yourself an ethicist? And very often they become embarrassed very quickly because they don't have a pedigree in ethics. Most questions that we're dealing with in AI are safety questions. Are we building systems that are minimizing bias? Are we building systems that are transparent, that are safe? And most AI projects fail not because of biases or not because of ethics. They fail for the same reason why traditional software projects fail, because they're not enough funding, or you don't maintain them, or you're using the wrong technology stacks. So I wouldn't get seduced or scared by a lot of the stuff that we're seeing currently in the media. Let me just switch now and talk about innovation, because I think this is really important. So most organizations operate in this way. Now, I'm sure you don't have any problems like this in your own organizations, but hierarchies breed certain types of interesting relationships. Now, I would argue these types of structures are not conducive for adaptation. Remember, adaptation is synonymous with intelligence. The more quickly you can adapt to a changing world, the more intelligent you are. And you will know in your own mind, based on your own discipline, your own domain, where there are opportunities to build these types of adaptive systems. So I want you to think, when I'm doing this talk, about where you can apply these types of ideas. And what we've seen over the past decade and over the next decade is the embracing of new types of organizational structures like Agile and Scrum and design thinking. And the principle here is that we are building organizations that can be much more adaptable. And most organizations are now going on this journey. I won't go through all of these different details, but we're actually seeing the use of AI in these technologies, not in just selling more stuff and profiling customers and doing best next action and customer journeys. We're not only using these technologies to optimize our supply chains and do last mile delivery and all this kind of stuff, but actually we're seeing these technologies to reinvent how companies operate. Because I would argue if you're not using these technologies to create innovative organizations, you're probably dying from the inside. And that might be a bit controversial, but I'm going to talk a little bit about this now. So I would actually argue that this technology stack that I've just described to you is probably going to become a commodity over over the next 10 years. We already have access to very cheap computers. We have access to lots and lots of data. All of the tools you need to build chatbots, million neuron brains, are all free. It's all open source. You don't have to pay for it. At some point, somebody will commoditize decision making, maybe Satalia, and somebody will commoditize self-learning. The battleground for organizations is not technology. The battleground is talent. How do you attract, retain, motivate talent, and enable that talent to innovate? Now, Steve Jobs had a really great definition for innovation. He said, innovation is creativity that ships. And the most important word in that definition to me is the word that. That is getting ideas and getting to the point where they're making money. And we want to shorten that process as much as possible. And there'll be tons and tons of opportunities in your organizations where we can remove the friction from that innovation process. And these technologies are perfect for removing friction. But what we need to do is we need to unlock the creative capacity of our talent and enable them to innovate. And there's a very good book by a guy called Dan Pink. He said there are three things that motivate people: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy is giving people the freedom to do what they want, and mastery is giving them the ability to become really good at what they want, and purpose is giving them something higher to align themselves with. And we know the purpose is now at the top of most organizations' agenda. So one of the challenges you have in the first place is, how do you attract talent? I often work with many CEOs and ask them, where are you on this matrix? How sexy is your brand or your industry, and how interesting or challenging are your problems? Because if you're not sexy and you don't have interesting problems, you're not going to attract talent. And you need to be honest with yourself. If you're sexy and you've got interesting problems, you'll attract talent and they will stay with you. And if you're in the other two quadrants, you'll attract talent and they will leave after a few years. And that can be more dangerous to your company than not being able to attract talent at all. So being honest with yourself will help you understand whether you build out your own AI teams, whether you augment that talent base with a third-party vendor, or whether you buy technologies off the shelf. But once you have attracted talent in one way, you need to then be able to then create an organization that enables that talent to thrive. And over the past decade, we've seen a flattening of organizations and new use of these technologies, communication technologies, to remove middle managers. Now, I would argue that whilst this is a step in the right direction, this is still not necessarily conducive for innovation. Whilst I only have about 100 people in Satalia, we've never had any traditional managers, hierarchies, KPIs. People have always been free to work where they want, how they want, wherever they want. How we've operated is like a swarm. And I'm really passionate about how we can use AI, not just to be able to sell more stuff or optimize our supply chain, but how can we create organizational structures that allow for emergent structures to solve problems, whether it's productizing what we do or whether it's services or whatever. How do we create an organizational structure that allows for innovations to get to market as fast as possible? And my goal is not just to scale this across WPP over the next several years, but my goal is to scale this to our planet. I think we should try and create a planet where everybody is free to come up with innovations, swarm around those innovations, and are able to be remunerated fairly for that contribution. And the enabler of these types of organizational structures is a concept called digital twins. Now, you might have heard the concept of a digital twin being applied to supply chain, where you're tying together all of the different elements of the supply chain, all the way from last mile to middle mile delivery, warehousing, workforce allocation in stores. Very often, these applications are brought in and solved individually. But what digital twins allow us to do is to create a layer, an AI layer that sits on top of them, that coordinates and orchestrates across the entire supply chain. Historically, what would happen is that marketing would create demand that would then put pressure on supply chain. The supply chain would then have to then satisfy that customer. What we can do is we can join all of these things together and create this intelligent layer, and even be able to identify capacity in the supply chain that could inform marketing. So we've got extra people in this store, we've got extra products in our warehouse. How can we build micro marketing campaigns to then use that resource in an effective way? And this is enabled through what is called digital twins. This is a digital twin of Satalia. My assets are not machinery, my assets are not vehicles, my assets are people. And what we can do is we can use data to understand the health of those assets, the relationships between them, the skills, the desires, the hopes and dreams. It does actually raise lots of interesting ethical questions. I can identify people in my company who are going to leave the company before they know they're going to leave. I can identify secret lovers in my company. It does raise lots of interesting questions, but we can use these technologies now to unlock the creative capacity of our talent base and enable those people to innovate. I won't talk about this. It's probably not so exciting for this audience, but maybe just one thing. We used to ask everybody every year in my company to make public recommendations for their salary. Everybody would publicly declare what they want to be paid, and then people would vote on whether those salaries should be reduced or increased or kept the same. And we would use machine learning to determine how many votes one person has for another. So if I've worked very closely with you over the past year, if I'm very knowledgeable about your domain, I will have more votes for your salary than other people. Now, we can apply this principle to figuring out what the next clothing line should be. We could use this principle to identify people who might know the type of demographics that are going to be coming into the store next week. So we can push these decisions to the people who are best placed to make those decisions, and then bring that information back so we can make effective decision making. This is a concept called decentralization. It's something I'm very, very passionate about, and now unlocking that knowledge base, that creative capacity of organizations using these types of ideas. So I'm just going to switch now and talk about the future. Again, this is where it gets a bit more fun. So I would argue there's a huge amount of misunderstanding around AI and the use of these technologies. Hopefully, I've convinced you that there are two definitions. One is weaker than the other. One is getting computers to do things that humans can do. We've been doing that for many, many decades. But the true paradigm of AI are building systems that are getting better all of the time, and that's very hard. Now, there's a lot of misplacement, a lot of misunderstanding about these technologies. But at the same time, whilst AI has had the biggest hype out of any technology, I think it is here to stay, David. I think that it's not going to go away. And I think that those organizations that get it right are the ones that are ultimately going to win. And I don't know if anybody knows who said this quote: "The nation that leads in AI will be the rule of the world." This was Vladimir Putin recently saying, talking to a group of school kids. We need to acknowledge that if you're an organization that get this right, it will be very, very difficult for any organization, any competitor to keep up with you. Now, there is lots of, again, scaremongery associated with the impact of these technologies on society in the long term. And what I've tried to do here is capture some of those concepts using this framework called PESTLE. You might have heard this framework before. It's a macro analysis framework. And you've already heard me mention the term singularity, which is a point in time that we can't see beyond. The exponential nature of these technologies means it's making it more and more difficult to see the future. And what I've tried to do here is capture 6 things that we're currently seeing in the press, in the media, into one framework. So the first one is the political singularity, when we no longer know what is true. Now, the deep fakes and fake news are already challenging the fabric of our reality. I heard recently there was a machine learning model that was trained on the voice of a CEO, and they got the machine learning model to call up the accounts department to pay an invoice. And they, of course, paid the invoice because they were talking to the CEO. So these types of technologies are challenging the fabric of our reality, and it's putting pressure on our political systems. And we need to figure out how to mitigate this. And actually, WPP need to be front and center in how we use these technologies for good. The economic singularity is probably one of the things that's most popular in the press at the moment. And this was actually coined by a very good friend of mine, Callum Chase. This is the point in time where we automate the majority of human labor. Now, AI is enabling people to free up tasks, to remove them from manual tasks, enabling them to do more interesting things. But the pressure to reduce costs means that when we have the opportunity to free up labor, we probably will. And that means removing people from jobs. And the concern here is that it's going to create mass technological employment, and our economies are not ready for such mass unemployment. The flip side is that if we get this right, and I genuinely believe we can get this right, is that we could actually create a world of abundance. We could create a world where people don't have to work if they don't want to work, a world where your nutrition, your healthcare, your education is free. We've managed to remove the friction from the creation of all of these goods that we consider to be luxurious, our coffee, our food, our healthcare, and we can make it abundant to everybody in the world. Now, imagine being born into a world where you're free to do whatever you want. You're free to boot up innovations. You're free to play the guitar. You're free to travel. That's the world that I want to create, and I genuinely believe that's a world that's possible to create over the next 40, 50 years. The social singularity is when we cure death. There are scientists that believe there are people alive today that won't have to die. And this will, again, change the fabric of our society. It will change how we educate ourselves. It will change our relationships, how we consume things. But again, there's a chance that this will happen in our lifetime. The technological singularity I've already alluded to, which is where we build a brain smarter than us in every single possible way. We have no idea what will happen when this thing comes. My goal is to try and figure out how to get humanity cooperating as a species, because if we're cooperating as a species, this thing might come and leave us alone. The environmental singularity, I know, is on the forefront of most people's minds, which is, consumption is great because it means that we're getting goods to people that can enjoy those goods, but it is putting pressure on our planetary boundaries. And we need to face into the fact that at some point we might create uncontrollable ecological collapse. And again, this is at the forefront of not just WPP's minds, but also our clients. And finally, the legal singularities, when surveillance becomes ubiquitous and there are companies, there are governments that hold so much data about people and have the ability to steer them in certain directions that benefit themselves. That's a very dangerous state to be in. So how can we mitigate this concept of surveillance capitalism, surveillance states? And again, this is something that we're really facing into and thinking about. I want to just close by saying that I don't believe that governments or Silicon Valley are necessarily going to solve all of these problems. I genuinely believe it's companies. Companies who have a strong purpose are going to attract customers. They're going to attract talent. Satalia's purpose is to enable everybody to be free to live beyond themselves, which aligns very strongly with the WPP purpose. I believe that we can use these technologies to unlock the creative capacity of everybody in humanity. We need to tap into that creative capacity to make the future a glorious place. And I want to work with as many people as possible to make that future a reality. So on that note, David, I'll open.
Well, Daniel, thank you very much indeed. That's a tour de force. I think you probably convinced everybody who's watching that AI is here and here to stay. And I think we'll debate for a long time into the future as to whether it's going to be a good or a bad thing from a sociological perspective. Daniel, before we go, we've got a few minutes. The long-term vision of what AI can do for individuals, companies, nations, humanity is absolutely vast and all-encompassing, as indeed it should be. There are probably many individuals, companies watching this who haven't taken any significant steps into the AI world yet. What's your recommendation? How do you start? The vision is massive. What are the small steps to start with? Or indeed, do you not make small steps to start with? Do you have to make one giant leap?
That's a superb question, David. Thank you. So if you haven't started this journey yet, it's not a bad thing. I'm seeing many organizations that have leaped into this and have actually started to embark on huge digital transformations where I don't believe that they are architecting themselves for a sustainable future. So if you haven't started yet, it doesn't matter. So I think there are two things that you can do. One is I talked about this concept of moving to more agile ways of working, and we're already seeing companies using Scrum and Agile. Now it's interesting because what it does, it flips the power dynamic to the employees to choose the type of work that they think it should be doing. It also creates a digital footprint for you to understand what teams work together well and how to get the most out of your employees. So I think that's one step in the right direction, because I said if you're not looking after your employees, you're dying from the inside. But a more practical thing is that there are so many opportunities to remove friction from the marketing process all the way through to the supply chain. There are thousands of opportunities, and what we can do is we can help organizations understand where those frictions are, and many of the organizations already have a backlog of frictions, and they're already looking at buying solutions off the shelf or building them themselves. The only thing I would caution here is that as you're addressing those frictions, try to make sure that you're connecting everything up in a data layer. Again, we're seeing organizations get that wrong. So don't just go and build a data lake straight away, because I think that is the wrong thing to do. But as you're bringing in addressing these frictions, can start connecting the data, but also start connecting the solutions. So rather than just having, again, a very optimized warehouse or a very optimized last mile delivery system, what will happen is if you're not co-optimizing them together, they're going to start to push queues and put pressure on each other. So how can you then start to build an intelligent layer that starts to sit across your entire supply chain all the way through to marketing that has a complete view of your organization? Now, that's a 10-year journey, but if you start getting that right now, which we believe that we know how to architect organizations in this way, then you're going to be in good shape.
Dan, you talked about singularity. I mean, is it worth individuals and organizations to create their own singularities in the sphere that they're operating in order to contextualize what it is they want to achieve in the context of using AI to do that?
Indeed, actually, I was at a talk recently where Satalia has this incredible capability in logistics. And somebody asked me, what does the transportation singularity look like? And actually, a transportation singularity is a ubiquitous transportation system where everybody can put in their resource. They can say, I'm driving from A to B. I've got this type of vehicle tomorrow. And that resource can then be utilized by any retailer to do deliveries or move supply around or whatever. Now, that's again a vision that's very, very far in the future. But what we're seeing, smart organizations, Alibaba and others, platformizing their technologies to try to actually make this those singularities happen, where you actually own that entire platform, whether it's the transportation platform or warehousing platform. That's definitely happening. And the organizations that have that strong vision of platformization are the ones that are going to own that space.
Well, last year for 11/11, Alibaba turned over, about $47 billion in a few days. This year, by all accounts, I think we've said today, it looks like for the first couple of days, 40% year-on-year increases is not unlikely. Dan, what do you think you could do with all that data that's been thrown off all those billions of transactions?
Well, it's again a great question. Thank you. So I'm salivating because Alibaba is an archetypal decentralized methodology, decentralized organization, and because it's decentralized, you have this incredible network effect of interactions that you can leverage. That there will be tons and tons of data, tons and tons of opportunities to improve the efficiency of all of those supply chain, all of those individual agents, and I'd salivate to get my teeth into them.
Well, hopefully we could do that soon. But yes. For the moment, Daniel, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you very much for not only painting the vision of what AI could do, but doing it in such a sort of an entertaining and a non-geeky way. I think that's really helped everybody to understand and contextualize what it can do for them. Great to see you. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much, David, for joining us.
Thank you.